one of the interesting things that has come about recently is this expose of scientism and just the complete absurdity of the entire theory of scientism, which is supposedly was about science, and then it became a religion and has all these precepts that you have to believe in, like it's some kind of a religious dogma. And the world has to be this way, and these are the equations that describe the world, and the speed of light, this is the speed of light, it's a constant, and all this stuff that we're sold. None of that turns out to be true. And that's what I loved about Terrence Howard on Joe Rogan. So for those of us who've been aware for decades that the scientism principles sold to us by NASA and Neil deGrasse Tyson and all of the physics stuff that we learned in universities has major problems and major flaws, and thinking outside of that box, it involves major amounts of suppression. For those of us who figured that out decades ago, we know what's going on. So we see Terrence Howard and we're like, oh, thank God, a light of hope, somebody who's thinking differently. I'm a fan of Steve Jobs. He said, think different. And I've been thinking different my whole life. So this is where we are now, is that we're starting to break up the principles of the scientism dogma, which is really a religion. And so when Terrence Howard, if you saw that broadcast with Joe Rogan, when he contacted Neil deGrasse Tyson, of course, instead of being friendly, Neil deGrasse Tyson is in opposition. He's actually fighting any change to the system. So essentially, for those of us who got the download, humanity, through the love from your heart and through the things you want to share, you build a structure, whatever that structure is. It could be a university, could be a series of scientific principles. But then comes later the people who then want to then calcify that structure. And then the love goes out, and all that's left is just the structure, which is all calcified, and it's like a castle, and no one's going to be getting in here, and you have to follow all these rules to get through the gate, and all the stuff today that we see in every area. It's every area, right? Even if you want to cut hair, you have to get licensed. That means you have to follow some tests. That means you have to follow these different steps that they want you to memorize. Everything is like this. And it's coming to an end, right? So in this end time, it's really not an end time. It's the end time of all of that stuff, the licensing, the registration. You have to have the bureaucracy, the unbelievable amounts of calcification, which have beset our society. Those are all going away. They're going to disappear because they collapse under their own weight. There's no love in them. And so what they're attempting to do now is to use technology to try to keep that stuff in place. But when the love goes out, the structure goes out. So what Terrence Howard has been doing has been awesome. He's just thinking differently. I'm thinking, what an amazing human being, whether you agree with him or not, that this guy is spending his time studying the secrets of the universe, that he's willing to go outside of the box. He's not studying Niels Bohr anymore, and the Heisenberg and all these other people, and Schrodinger's cat and all this other stuff. He's thinking outside the box. And he went to Walter Russell. He went to Victor Schauberger. It was so great to hear those names said. For those of us who've been on that tip for decades, many of you have seen my videos going back decades where I had that periodic table of the elements that Terrence Howard talked about, that Walter Russell created way back 80 years ago. It's really incredible to see it finally coming around. So essentially, those of you who are tuning into this broadcast, most likely, inner circle, people out there on the internet, you're kind of ahead of the curve and you kind of get things earlier than most people. So what we're seeing is kind of a catch up now happening. And the breakdown of scientism is a very important part of that catch up, because that's all these straight lines and angles and everything that we hear from the scientism crowd is not what's natural. There's no straight line in nature. Come on. And I loved how Terrence brought that up. So we could nitpick Terrence's presentation. Sure. We can nitpick his life. Sure. But I'll tell you one thing we can't nitpick, that the guy thinks differently. That he's not spending his time, wasting his time scrolling all day, or wasting his time chasing girls all day, or wasting his time in some Hollywood fantasy. None of that. It was really refreshing to see that, and how into what he's doing he is. My God, that was refreshing. Now, sure, he's taking it to a point that we also understand, which is there is no absolute truth of anything. All that we can do as humans, maybe the God is the absolute truth, but all we can do is get closer. And I call that an asymptote. So what he's presenting is closer to the truth than anything that we got in schools and universities, that's for sure. The negative spaces, his linchpin model, his geometry models that he presented was phenomenal. Absolutely out of the box thinking. I was like, this guy's a genius. This is epic. Again, whether you agree with it or not, this guy's coming up with new ideas. He's innovating, right? Of course, in a Luddite society, everybody wants to just bang him down like, no, get him back in the crowd, get him back in the crowd. No, not in America. That's not what we do in America. Maybe they do that in London. Maybe they do that in Europe somewhere. Maybe they do that in other countries. But in this country, we got to let our bright light shine. You'll notice that the Marxism, the cultural Marxism, is about dimming down the light of anybody who stands out, who's a real thinker, anybody who stands out, who's a real innovator, right? The whole thing is about shedding all that down. I mean, this is ultimately what the Ahrimanic deception is about. It's really about, it's a shocking statement. It's about actually shutting down innovation. It's shutting down industry. There was a great statement the other day. Trump said, he was like, we're not going to drive the cryptocurrency market and innovation out of America by Elizabeth Warren and her goons. She's absolutely right. That's a great point to be, because ultimately, we're realizing that all of our innovation has been driven out of the United States of America by the regulation, by the social engineers, by the people who don't want us thinking differently. We need to get out of this bureaucratic communist socialist disaster and actually let the bright light shine without the criticism of personal ad hominem attacks. Let's get at the geometry. Like, look at this guy's amazing geometry, and then how he's linked that geometry together into all kinds of different new structures, maybe new furniture, new lighting systems, all kinds of interesting things. That was incredible. It was incredible. Now, personally, as a person who's been pursuing Walter Russell's knowledge and Victor Schauberger's knowledge for the better part of 30 years, I can tell you that one thing that my critique of, in particular of both of them, but mostly of Walter Russell, is he's very Platonic. He's very like Plato, in the sense of like idealistic, which is great. And that's a beautiful thing for humanity to strive for. And that's basically where Terrence is too. He's creating ideals that are beautiful for people to strive to. And those of us living in the real world realize that it's not ideal, that there's a rational and irrational side of our reality. There's a logical and illogical side of our reality. And that illogic, the irrational number, the run-on number, in my opinion, my research, is where the energy, the ectropic, the opposite of entropy, the organizational forces bleed in. They bleed in through the irrational number. So there's a dynamic disequilibrium. See, the Walter Russells of the world and the Terrence Howards of the world will always give us like the yin yang sign, the perfect symmetry, that kind of idea. There is no perfect symmetry, not in this world. I've never seen it. You probably have never seen it either. And that's an important thing to include into our philosophy of reality. So again, to the Terrence Howard's, wonderful guy. My God, amazing. What an amazing presentation just to come out with. I was like, what is this? What's going on here? And of course, Walter Russell and the Victor Schaubergers. The thing about this world is that we have two sides to the equation. So we have the idea of perfect symmetry, then we have the irrational. So that would be best described in another way like this. In that model, it's still in some ways Cartesian in this sense, or it's still in some way Newtonian in this sense. For every effect, there's a cause. Wrong. That's incorrect. That's incorrect. There are acausal phenomenon. There are effects that have no cause, and that's synchronicity and hypersynchronicity. Acausal phenomenon. And that has to be knitted into our structure and our philosophy of reality. And those are my thoughts on the Joe Rogan, Terrence Howard interview, which I thought was refreshing and beautiful. And thank God that got out there for all the people to see. And it was also fascinating to see everybody saying, you got to see this interview. You got to check this out. Whereas most people have never really delved into those subjects, right? The space in between, what an amazing concept. The idea that there's no straight line, important concept, because I've never seen it. The idea that we can construct a geometry that's completely new and completely different based on these precepts that Howard's bringing, phenomenal, absolutely epic. And it moves the ball forward. He doesn't have to be a philosopher. He doesn't have to have a degree in engineering. He doesn't have to have a degree in physics or any of those things. I mean, the guy who invented the piano didn't have a degree in creating the piano. The fastest Rubik's Cube guy isn't the guy who invented the Rubik's Cube. And the person who invented the Rubik's Cube was not the fastest Rubik's Cube guy there is. So it's always people from the outside. Look at Steve Jobs, complete outsider, came in from outside, completely innovated an entire industry. Those are the leaders of the future, and those are the people we need to support. And so I love the way that Terrence chanted down Babylon with his new presuppositions, new theories, new ideas. That's what we need, not more scientism garbage that's been rammed down our throat and repeated over and over and over again in schools for 100 years now. That stuff's over. It didn't work. Now we're on to the better sciences. All right, those are my thoughts on that. Have the best day ever.